It seemed to me an absurd notion to cast a middle-aged, bald, English classical actor. A little bit now, but it still controls some of my decision-making and choices that I make.
It was May 23, 1994. Millions of viewers across the world sat watching the final moments of Star Trek: The Next Generation, a show that had redefined science fiction television for 7 incredible years.
Now, get ready for the original series' geeky younger brother, featuring new aliens, more complex stories.
They had witnessed epic space battles, profound moral dilemmas, and the evolution of Captain Jean-Luc Picard.
I hereby formally request third-party arbitration of our dispute.
From a distant, formal commander into something far more complex. But as the credits rolled on that final episode, one quiet scene left an entire generation in tears. It wasn't a dramatic goodbye or a heroic sacrifice. It was simply Picard sitting down at a poker table. The nature of the episode. For that ending to truly hit home, you first have to understand just how different All Good Things was from everything that came before.
And we were able to take on rather more radical.
The episode didn't follow the traditional formula. Instead, it jumped between 3 different time periods: past, present, and future, as the omnipotent being Q subjected Picard to one final test of humanity's worth. Writers Ronald D. Moore and Brannon Braga faced an almost impossible challenge. They had to craft something that honored 7 years of storytelling while also satisfying Paramount's demand for a finale that could drive audiences to the upcoming feature film. The network wanted spectacle. They wanted closure.
One night in a hotel somewhere, I'd flown in, I had ordered room service, and I was flicking through, and there was...
But Moore and Braga knew that the real story wasn't about saving the galaxy one more time. It was about saving Jean-Luc Picard from himself. The time-jumping structure allowed them to show different versions of the captain, each one revealing something about his journey. And in those final moments, when everything was resolved and the universe was safe once again, they needed a way to show that Picard had actually learned something from his decades in space. That's when they came up with the poker game. But here's the thing, that scene almost didn't happen. Why Picard was always alone. Throughout the entire run of The Next Generation, Captain Jean-Luc Picard maintained a carefully constructed distance from his crew. He was professional, formal, and deeply private.
Not required. We'll just have to see how ready you are.
While Riker, Data, and the others played poker in the crew quarters every week, Picard stayed in his ready room, reading Shakespeare and drinking Earl Grey tea in solitude. This wasn't accidental. It was the burden of command. As captain, he believed he couldn't afford to be their friend, only their leader. He made life and death decisions that affected everyone on that ship, and getting too close would compromise his judgment.
Actor said to me, "Look, you're a terrific actor. I really like your work."
Patrick Stewart understood this isolation intimately. As a classically trained Shakespearean actor, he had spent years perfecting roles that required emotional distance and regal bearing. He brought that same formality to Picard, creating a character who was brilliant, principled, and achingly lonely. Over 7 seasons, we saw glimpses of the man behind the captain. His love of archaeology, his complicated relationship with his family, his brief romances that never quite took hold. But always, he returned to that ready room. Always alone. That's what made the ending so devastating and so perfect. The poker game. Stewart's input. The poker game wasn't in the original draft of the finale. According to multiple interviews with the writing staff, the first version ended immediately after Picard solved Q's puzzle and saved humanity. It was Stewart himself who pushed for something more. He argued that after everything Picard had been through, jumping through time and facing the end of existence itself, the character needed to show that he had fundamentally changed. The writers listened. They crafted that final scene where Picard walks into the poker game that had been happening without him for 7 years. The crew is shocked. Picard asks if he can deal himself in, and Riker's response is perfect. "Of course, you should have done this a long time ago." When filming that scene, the emotions were real. The cast had spent 7 years together and they knew this was goodbye. Multiple takes were ruined because people couldn't stop crying. Stewart has said that when he delivered the line, "I should have done this a long time ago," he wasn't just speaking as Picard. He was speaking as himself, realizing what he was about to lose. The final line, "The sky's the limit," became iconic because it represented everything. Infinite possibility, hope, connection, a new beginning. Stewart's departure and return. When The Next Generation ended, Patrick Stewart made a very public declaration that he was done with Star Trek forever. He had spent 7 years in that captain's chair, and while he was grateful for the experience, he desperately needed to escape the shadow of Jean-Luc Picard.
So boring and tiresome. I had this thing about discipline, and I felt that the cast, my fellow...
Stewart was a serious actor with decades of classical training, and he feared being typecast as a science fiction character for the rest of his career. He threw himself into other projects, returning to Shakespeare, doing independent films, and eventually finding massive success with the X-Men franchise as Professor Xavier. For years, he refused every offer to return to the Star Trek universe. He turned down cameos, convention appearances, and lucrative deals. He wanted the world to see him as more than just a starship captain. But something shifted as he got older. Time gave him perspective. He began to understand what Picard had meant to millions of people, and more importantly, what the character had meant to him. When CBS approached him about a new series focusing on an older Picard, Stewart initially said no. But the pitch intrigued him. They weren't asking him to replay the same captain. They wanted to explore what happens to a hero after the adventure ends. Stewart's perspective at 72. Now at 72 years old, Patrick Stewart has had nearly 3 decades to reflect on that final poker game scene, and his perspective has evolved in profound ways. In recent interviews promoting the Picard series, Stewart has spoken openly about how he finally understands what that ending truly represented. He no longer sees it as just a nice moment between colleagues. He sees it as the culmination of Picard's entire journey toward becoming fully human. Stewart has drawn parallels between Picard's late-life revelation and his own experiences. He got remarried in his 70s and has spoken about finding a kind of happiness and openness he never allowed himself when he was younger. Just like Picard, Stewart spent much of his life maintaining walls, staying professional, keeping distance. The poker game, Stewart now says, represents the most important lesson a person can learn. That duty and excellence matter, but connection matters more.
Spent a lot of time recently watching Star Trek The Next Generation.
That it's never too late to let people in. That vulnerability isn't weakness. He has said in interviews that when he watches that scene now, he cries every single time because he finally understands that Picard wasn't just joining a card game. He was joining life itself. And that realization changed everything about how Stewart approached the character when he returned. Why this ending still resonates. Nearly 30 years later, All Good Things is still considered one of the greatest series finales in television history, and it's not hard to understand why. Unlike other Star Trek endings that relied on massive battles or bittersweet separations, The Next Generation chose something remarkably simple and deeply human. Deep Space Nine ended with Sisko ascending to a higher plane of existence. Voyager finally made it home after 7 years, lost in space. Enterprise went out with a whimper that fans are still angry about, but TNG ended with a card game, and that choice was genius. The finale avoided melodrama and grand statements. Instead, it gave us a quiet moment of human connection that felt earned after 7 years of watching Picard keep everyone at arm's length. There's a psychological reason this resonates so powerfully. We all know people like Picard, people who hide behind their work, their responsibilities, their need to be in control. We've all been that person at some point. The ending tells us that it's never too late to change, never too late to sit down at the table and say, "Deal me in." That message has only grown more powerful as the original audience has aged. We understand now what we couldn't at 20. Life is short. Connection is everything. The symbolism of the sky's the limit. That final line, "The sky's the limit," carries more weight than most viewers realize. On the surface, it's just poker terminology. indicating there's no maximum bet. But in the context of Picard's journey, it becomes a statement about life itself. For 7 years, Picard had imposed limits on himself. He limited his emotional availability, his willingness to be vulnerable, his capacity for friendship. He drew clear boundaries between captain and crew, never allowing himself to cross that line. The poker game represented the dismantling of all those self-imposed restrictions. Stewart has explained in interviews that this line was deliberately chosen to reflect Picard's transformation. By joining the game, Picard was acknowledging that he had been living within unnecessary constraints. He had been so focused on being the perfect captain that he forgot to be a complete human being. The sky's the limit meant that moving forward, he would no longer hold himself back. He would allow himself to experience the full spectrum of human connection, with all its risks and rewards. It was a promise to himself and to his crew that things would be different now. The beauty of this moment is that it doesn't erase who Picard was. He's still the captain. He's still the leader they respect and follow. But now he's also their friend. He's dealt himself into their world, not just as an authority figure, but as an equal participant in the messy, beautiful game of human relationships. That's why fans still quote that line decades later. It represents the hope that we can all break free from the prisons we build around ourselves. The perfect ending. Looking back 3 decades later, it's clear that the Next Generation's finale succeeded precisely because it rejected traditional expectations. Most series finales try to provide absolute closure, tying up every loose thread and leaving no ambiguity. All Good Things did the opposite. Yes, it resolved the immediate threat of Q's trial and the temporal anomaly that threatened all of existence, but it left the future wide open. The final scene doesn't show us what happens next. We don't see Picard's next mission or his future adventures. We simply see him sitting at a table with his friends, laughing, betting chips, and finally allowing himself to be part of something beyond duty. This open-ended quality has allowed the ending to age beautifully. Because the show didn't lock itself into a specific conclusion, it left room for fans to imagine countless futures for these characters. It left room for the movies that followed. And decades later, it left room for the Picard series to explore what happened to the captain after he finally learned to let people in. Stewart has said that this was the genius of the writers. They understood that the best endings aren't really endings at all. They're new beginnings. The finale also works because it stays true to what Star Trek has always been about. Not space battles or alien encounters, but the human condition. The exploration of what it means to be better, to grow, to connect. Picard's journey from isolation to connection is fundamentally a story about choosing hope over fear. It's about recognizing that the walls we build to protect ourselves often become the prisons that trap us. And it's about the courage required to tear those walls down, even when it's terrifying. That's a message that transcends science fiction. It's a message about being human, and that's why it still makes people cry. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of television's most perfect finales and want to explore more untold stories from the golden age of sci-fi and beyond, make sure you hit that subscribe button. We're uncovering the secrets, the emotions, and the truths behind Hollywood's most iconic moments every single week. Thanks for watching. And as Picard would say, make it so.